In today's video, I want to discuss some points that were made to me in a comment section in one of my videos about whether or not we as Christians have actually missed the coming of Jesus Christ already. So what I want to show you today is something. I got into a conversation with someone in the comment section in one of my videos recently, and I thought I wanted to do a video on this particular topic. I've touched on some of these topics before, but as you can see here on screen, this was just different points based on different references which were basically given to me as to why ultimately we as Christians should accept that Christ has ultimately returned already. This isn't new or like isolated to this one particular individual, right? There are people out there who do believe that Jesus' second coming has happened already. Now, I'm not obviously one of them, but the reason I basically did this and I want to do this video is because I actually asked the person, I said, you know what? The person was going on about, you know what, Jesus has come already, etc. All the scriptures point to this. And I said, look, I'm still waiting for you to send me some scriptures. So these were the list of scriptures, right, which are just the start. And I thought I'd basically jump through some of these passages to kind of give just some quick thoughts based on what has actually been said. So let's look at the first point, and then we'll basically jump into the Bible. And here are just some ways you can respond and engage with someone who believes that Christ has ultimately come already. So the first point here we can see is this is taken from Matthew's gospel account, right? And it's basically Jesus saying here that they're not going to go over all of their cities, the disciples that is, and before the Son of Man ultimately comes. And as you can see, this is from Matthew chapter 10 verse 23, right? And the point he makes here is the disciples won't finish going through Israel before he comes back, right? So before we jump into the passage, let me break this down. So his point is, Jesus said, go and preach to the cities of Israel. Before you get through all of these cities, I'm going to have returned already, right? Now, let's go into the passage, and I'll read the passage, give some of my thoughts on the passage, but also think about things in a broader context, which also make this view based on this particular passage problematic. So let's basically bring this up. He's basically, another thing, he's quoting from the Young's Literal translation. So let's do the Young's Literal, right? And go to Matthew 10. And remember, his point is that Jesus said they would not go through all the cities before he ultimately returned. So as I'm always going to say is, you always want to focus on context. And I believe context really answers this question here, because he was highlighting verse 23 here. And this is a lesson I always teach people over and over again. Don't ever just isolate one particular verse in the Bible, right? This is a quick way for you to miss just the point of what's actually going on. So you can see here, this is what he's referencing. Jesus is sending out his disciples, and Jesus says here, you're not going to have completed the cities of Israel till the Son of Man may come. Now, his point is, look, Jesus is saying quite clearly, I'm sending you out to preach in these different cities, and before you basically finish these cities, I'm going to have ultimately returned already. Now, as I always say, don't get bogged down to one particular verse in the Bible. That's a quick way for you to miss the mark. And I just believe clearly by reading additional context, you can see the answer even more clearly. Why? Because what is Jesus saying here? Hopefully this can be beneficial to this person who sent me this message. So look what it says. This is where Jesus has ultimately called 12 disciples, right? And he's given them power to cast out devils, to heal the sick, etc. And what does he say? He says, go not into the way any city of the Samaritans, and don't go anywhere near the Gentiles, basically. Just go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The Hebrew Israelites love these particular passages, right? But again, they make the same mistake this person's making if this person is not a Hebrew Israelite themselves, right? But notice, he gives all of these commands, right, etc. Don't take any money, go 2 by 2, etc. So they believe that the Son of Man was going to be coming. Now, what I will say to you first and foremost, before we get back to that particular passage, is I believe just contextually reading this passage, even cross-referencing this with Luke chapter 9, you can see that Jesus here is talking about they're not going to have gone through all of these different cities before the Son of Man comes and preaches in these cities. You see, Jesus was having his disciples basically pave the way for him. They'd go and preach and heal and all these different kind of things, and he'd come to the cities. So the point Jesus is making here is, you're not going to have finished all of these different cities before I've basically come to the cities. Now, we can get this quite clearly from context. Why? Because as he finishes it, saying all this stuff, right, it's all red letters, right? He's saying the whole thing. When we go to the next chapter so to speak, what does he say? And it came to pass when Jesus ended directing his 12 disciples, so everything he just said, he departed thence to teach and to preach where? In their cities. Think about this contextually. He says to them, look, I'm appointing you as 12 apostles. I'm sending you out now to go and cast out devils, heal the sick, and basically go into these particular cities in Israel. Don't go to any Samaritan cities. Don't go to any of the Gentiles. And before you finish, the Son of Man is ultimately going to become. And then after he's finished his whole monologue, he then turns around in the very next chapter, which really wouldn't be the next chapter when Matthew was writing this, but then says, after he'd finished commanding his disciples, obviously they've been sent out, then he went to preach in each of these different cities of Israel. So it clearly makes sense what he's ultimately talking about, right? Another thing for you to consider as well is he said, don't go to any of the Samaritans. Now, this causes multiple problems if you want to take this view even deeper than what I've just showed you in regards to the context. Why? Because firstly, what do we see? Jesus visited a Samaritan city in John's gospel account, right? In John chapter 4, the woman at the well. That's one thing. That would cause issues if you wanted to hold to that belief. Another thing it causes problems with is at the end of Matthew's gospel account, he says, go into all nations, right? Making disciples of all men, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Luke's gospel account, and even in the first page of Acts, right? Luke's second volume, what does he say? You're going to start in Jerusalem, and then you're going to go to Judea, and then Samaria, and then the whole world. So if Jesus is here saying, and it means in Matthew that, no, this is only for this particular place, and then I'm going to become, why would Jesus in Acts now say, you know what, you're going to go all over. You're not just going to go to the Israelite cities, you're going to go to Samaria, and then you're going to go to the ends of the earth. It causes problems if you take that kind of view, right? And then it's going to put you in a position where you may have to now explain Acts away. You may have to now explain the end of Matthew's gospel account, his very own gospel account, when he's saying go into all nations. But really just contextually by reading Matthew, even cross-referencing this with Luke chapter 9, it's actually quite clear what's actually happening here. Let's now go to the next example in his particular referencing. As you can see here, he now quotes another passage in Matthew, and it says, for the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his messengers, and then he will rule. So he's basically saying the Son of Man is going to come back, right? And then he basically quotes, this is from Matthew chapter 16, and he says, after talking about the Father ruling according to the works, bad or good, Jesus said to the disciples, if they won't die, speaking of to them, not us, right? So this is the point. Jesus said, look, I'm going to come back, and you are still going to be alive when this stuff actually happens. So let's go to Matthew chapter 16 and see. And I've mentioned this in recent live streams ultimately. So I'll basically probably link that down in the description box so I don't have to just go over this in deep detail. But as you can see here, right, for the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his messengers, and then he will reward each according to his work. Verily I say unto you, there are certain of those standing here who shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his reign. Now, this is a common objection to why Jesus ultimately has not returned yet, right? People who believe Jesus has come already. Now, notice when you cross-reference this with the other gospel accounts that mention this, in all three examples, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what we call the synoptic gospels, the next thing they mention in all of the gospel accounts is what? This right here, which is the Mount of Transfiguration. Why is this significant? Because when you read this contextually, right, Jesus is ultimately transfigured, right? He's taken off the veil, so to speak. His skin is shining bright like the sun, right? Why is that significant? Because that links into what he's ultimately just said about some of you standing here will not die until you see the kingdom of God come with power. What did they see about a week later? They see Jesus high up in a mountain, transfigured, right, bright like the sun, right, in a glorified sort of state. This is the same kind of glory we see in the book of Revelation at the start when it talks about Jesus is ultimately shining bright like the sun, right? So that was what he was talking about. And the three gospel accounts, like I mentioned previously, all reference this in the very next line. Another thing for us to consider as well is definitely read Luke's gospel account. Luke's gospel account really makes this quite clear, because he even talks about the glory, and he talks about how he appeared in glory, right? Luke spells it out for you. The next one was this, again, Matthew. Can you see the common theme here? A lot of this stuff is coming from Matthew. But when we cross-reference this with other passages in the gospel accounts, and we look at other passages in the Bible, this is why I don't believe that Jesus has ultimately come already. So he's quoting Matthew 24, verse 20 to 31 here, and his whole point is the tribulation is going to come after. And what does he say? Let's read his point. He says, after his warning of the destruction of Jerusalem, he tells them that immediately they would see the Son of Man and the angel would gather the elect, right? So Jesus talks about Jerusalem basically being destroyed or whatever, the temple being destroyed. And then he says, after all of this stuff, you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds. That's not actually quite true. And I think an issue which is coming up again, right, which I think is really significant, is, again, context. And I'm going to say this over and over again. When it comes to reading the Bible, don't make the mistake of reading one line, because it's easy to formulate many doctrines when it comes to reading one line. But the more and more we become contextual at reading the passages, it makes it so much more clearer. How does it start? The disciples show him the temple, right? And what does Jesus say? The temple is basically going to be destroyed, as the statement alluded to. And then what does he say? Sorry, what did they say? The disciples come and they ask him, how many questions did they ask him? The statement this person made seems to suggest or indicate like it's one thing, but no, what did they say? Tell us, when shall these be? So when shall what be? When shall the temple be destroyed? But also does he say, and what the sign of thy presence? So when is Jerusalem going to be destroyed? When is the sign of your coming? And when is the full end of the age? When is the end of the world? So they asked 3 different questions, right? Now, again, when you read through this passage, when you cross-reference with the other gospel accounts, you can see that although Jesus is speaking about different things, right, we have to remember that there's 3 things being asked of Jesus. So not all things are going to be talking about the same thing. And especially when you look at Matthew's gospel account and Luke's gospel account, Luke makes a clear distinction with things which happen before the end, opposed to what happens at the end. But let's just stick in Matthew, for example. So he talks about, look, there's going to be different things. There's going to be people come and say they're Christ and all of these different kind of things. And what does he say? But the end is not yet. This is powerful when you think about what he's just said and you think about what Luke does in his gospel account. And what does he say next? Nation will rise against nation, and he goes on, right? And then what does he say? Those that endure to the end shall be saved. And it continues going. And this good news of the reign shall be proclaimed in all the world for a testimony to all the nations, and then shall the end arrive. So the end isn't going to come until everyone has basically heard the gospel preached. And then what does he say? Whenever, therefore, you may see the abomination of the desolation, right? This is an allusion to the book of Daniel. This did not happen, right, in the 1st century when the temple was destroyed. That is a big marker right there for you, just for the record. But what does he say anyway? Go to the mountains, don't come back into your house, run away basically and get out. And his particular verse is, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall not give her light. And then he basically goes on, and then you shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. But the point is, notice this. Remember, they asked Jesus 3 questions. So this long monologue from Jesus is answering 3 questions. When will the temple be destroyed? What will be the signs of your coming? And what is the sign of the end of the world? All of this monologue is now detailing 3 answers. So you have to do your job, and especially by cross-referencing the different passages in the gospel accounts which touch on this particular point, to identify what is being talked about the destruction of the temple, what is in reference to him coming back, and what is in reference to the end of the world. Don't just necessarily infer on the text that they're all talking about the same event, because they're clearly not when you cross-reference the gospel accounts, right? If you're going to stick to Matthew's gospel account by itself, then that's one thing, right? And even within, like we've talked about, you can see there's clear distinctions in the passage in and of itself. That gets even more distinct when you're looking at other passages in the gospel accounts as well. The next thing he says, which I thought was actually quite interesting, Paul says the gospel has been preached to the world already, which means it was contextual for Abraham's actual seed, the 12 tribes who had been scattered, divorced and brought back, right? And he basically quotes Colossians chapter 1, where I'll show you this in a moment. So his next point is, look, I guess he's taking this off the back of what Jesus just said in regards to Matthew. The gospel needs to be preached everywhere. And now he's saying, look, Paul said the gospel had basically been preached. So let's look at what they're referring to in this particular passage. If we just stretch out a lot of these passages and we think more about the context, like someone doesn't have to necessarily believe these things. And these are just by me looking at these right now, right? So this is Colossians, which is what he's referring to, where Paul says, look, this gospel, this good news was preached in all the creation that under the heaven, of which I, Paul, a ministrant, right? So Paul's just basically saying, this message has gone out to all of creation under heaven, and he is a minister. So look, his point is, again, Paul said the message has been preached. So because the message has ultimately been preached to everyone, that ultimately means that Jesus has ultimately come again. Now, there's a couple of ways you can consider what's actually happening here, right? One thing you can consider in this situation is Paul is basically just highlighting the Roman Empire, right? Which in one way could be classified as the world, right? Because they were the world rule at the day. But in another sense, that doesn't necessarily cover the whole world, because that wasn't the whole world at that particular time, right? So he could just be saying the whole of the Roman Empire has heard of the gospel. Another thing which I kind of thought about as well when I read this is something quite significant, which I believe there's 2 points which most likely is what Paul's alluding to here. We should take into consideration other writings by Paul, right? And notice this. Paul at the beginning of Romans makes a strong case to what? To everyone being guilty before God's eyes. Why? For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world, by the things made being understood, are plainly seen, both his eternal power and Godhead, to their being inexcusable, right? The point Paul is basically making here is, look, the invisible things, so God and his existence and his and his power, are evident through the visible things we can see, through the creation. Who has seen creation? Everyone has seen creation, right? So in some senses, everyone is without excuse. That is the point Paul is basically making. Whether you've been under the law or whether you haven't received the law, we are all under the law ultimately of God, because God has created the world, which testifies of his goodness, of his power, of his glory. Because there was something else in Romans which actually took me to Romans in my thoughts when I thought about what he ultimately said. And this comes later on in Romans. This isn't a surprise. What does Paul say? He says, but I say, did they not hear? Right? He's talking about Israel, so to speak. And he says, yes, indeed. Then what does he say? To all the earth their voice went forth, and to the ends of the habitable world their sayings. Now, what is he talking about? He's basically saying, because the context here is Israel being judged. Why are Israel basically being judged? Why are Israel being blinded for their sin, etc.? And just like he mentioned in the first part of Romans, what's he mentioning here? He's now talking about, have they not heard? And he's saying, yes, indeed, the message has gone all over the world, to everywhere that's inhabitable. And for those of you who don't know, he's here quoting a Psalm 19, which is what? It's similar to what Paul mentions in Romans, which isn't a surprise based on the fact he started his letter to the Romans with this particular point. In Psalm 19, he's talking about how the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And he's talking about how all of the things in the heavens show God's handiwork, right? And it's gone out to everyone in the world for everyone to see. So when Paul is talking in Colossians about the message that's gone to everyone in the world, why is it such a surprise if he's talking about the creation in and of itself, if he's not talking about just the Roman Empire, when he's mentioned in other writings as well, and will mention in other writings like Romans, that the creation is a gospel message, is a message of God's sovereignty and power to the whole world. Then he mentions 2 passages, one from Psalm 147 and one from Amos chapter 3, which is basically passages, as you can see, talking about how God basically is dealing with Israel and God isn't dealing with anybody else. Now, there's a couple of problems with this, first and foremost, right? Firstly, I don't believe quite clearly God is saying what they think he's saying, because many people, especially Hebrew Israelites, will say something along the lines of, look, you know what? God doesn't business with any other nation. And to a certain degree, that's true, right? God made the covenant with Israel. But to say that God doesn't deal or have anything to do with other nations is quite problematic, even if you want to stick to the Old Testament passage. I love a passage I love to reference regularly is of a Gentile king called Abimelech, right? Gentile king in Philistine country Gerar in Genesis, right? He's not an Israelite, but he has a deep relationship with God, right? Where they're communicating and they have a relationship first and foremost. There's different examples in the Old Testament where God is dealing with people who are Gentiles. Rahab, the harlot, she's a Canaanite, right? She's not from the line of Israel. She's not a Hebrew, right? She's from Canaan, which come from Ham, right? So there's different examples in the Bible where God is engaging with Gentiles to the point where they can ultimately be grafted in. They can have a relationship with him. So for us to isolate one particular passage, even in Amos, for example, God is chastising the Gentile nations before he gets to Israel, right? And he's holding them to a different standard. Why? Because he's given Israel the law and the covenant, right? So Israel is more on the hook because they have the law and the covenant. The Gentile nations didn't necessarily have the law of the covenant until they decided to come and be grafted in, like Rahab, people along those lines, right? If you were not part of the Israelite nation, you were not grafted in any way, you didn't want to have a relationship with God, just like in Amos, God held you accountable to what Paul referenced, the creation, these things which highlight and show God's handiwork. He goes to Hebrews next and he talks about how this covenant, according to Hebrews, is only a reference to those who are ultimately under the first covenant, right? And let's look at this particular passage. Again, we're looking from the Young's literal translation as this person was quoting. I want to say, and because of this, again, context, right? This is the writer of Hebrews, who I believe is Paul, talking here about how Jesus ultimately comes and offers a new, better covenant. And he says, because of this, of a new covenant, he is a mediator. That's Christ, right? Christ now intercedes for us as a high priest, that death having come, right? So death came, what? Through the Old Testament law, right? For redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. So it's not saying it's just for the transgressors of the old covenant. It's talking about the transgressions. So all of the laws, right, which God set up, which we all miss the mark at and we fail. Now because of that, we are now ultimately not able to survive. We die. Those called, right, may receive the promise of the age during inheritance. So we ultimately all receive salvation for believing that the high priest of the new covenant, Jesus, covers our sins from all of the transgressions we commit, which breach the Old Testament law, right? And he basically just talks about how this is a much better covenant based on what we're ultimately dealing with now, because we have a much better high priest after the order of Melchizedek. He goes on to Jeremiah, which is talking about a covenant for Israel. And we've talked already, so I don't want to go into this even more so. Just about Israel had Gentiles grafted in all the way through the Old Testament. So even if it was specifically talking about Israel, Gentiles are grafted into this covenant as well. Especially after, as it talks about in Romans, that the Israelites basically rejected the Messiah, not all of them, but the majority of them. So that ultimately opened up for the Gentiles. He talks about Revelation about people seeing him, as you can see here. Those who killed Jesus would see him. And he's referencing Revelation here. And I don't see a problem with this. That is what the Bible tells us that will happen. Let's go to the Young's literal translation, which he quoted, and read it. So this is what he quoted. Lo, he doth come with the clouds. So Jesus is coming with the clouds. And see him shall who? Every eye. So every eye is going to see him. Then what does he go? He goes further. Even those who did pierce him. So if every eye is going to see him, and then it goes deeper and says, even those who did pierce him, and will well because of him, shall all the tribes of the land. Yes, amen. So the point here is, yes, the Jews who basically gave him over to be crucified will see him, and they'll basically be weeping and wailing, calling out for their Messiah now, right, to save them. Also, the other nations, every eye shall see him, especially even those who ultimately gave him over to be crucified, his own countrymen, his own kindred, the Israelites, right? So there's no problem here in this particular narrative. Now, what he says next is quite interesting. He goes on talking about how there's many more Bible scriptures which reference this. And again, we've gone through some of which he's referenced, which clearly don't indicate that Christ has ultimately come again. unless you isolate the text to one line. But then he says Daniel is told to seal up the book. So Daniel's told, close up the book. It's not for now, right? Because Daniel's seeing prophetically about the future. And he says John in Revelation is told not to seal up the book because of that the time was near. Now, we would not have a problem with this. We believe John is in the spirit, as the Bible says in Revelation multiple times. He's seeing these things in the spirit. He's seeing visions. And he's seeing these things unfold in real time. I've been going for about 30 minutes. And look what he says here. He says, this is because Revelation was written before 70 AD. And notice what he says. If it was written after 70 AD, then it is false prophecy. It constantly tells us that the time is near over and over again. Now, the reason this stood out to me so like significantly is because this is the kind of statement which could make this whole video I just made pointless. Because if he's not willing to see the revelation as written in any other period in time before the temple is destroyed, that is basically him pigeonholing himself to this particular view. If he's willing to say Revelation is false prophecy, then he could basically say anything is not accurate prophecy because it doesn't line up with the view that I ultimately hold. We can't take that approach to reading the Bible. We have to put ourselves in a position where we're actually looking at the passages and letting the passage speak and not us speak into the passage what we think. I believe all of the points he raised are easily answerable, as I've done, just basically just looking at his passage references quite clearly. And I'd love to engage with this person even more so, because I believe if he's truly willing to accept the scriptures as he quotes them, we'll see that they can't be saying what he believes they're ultimately saying. Hopefully this has been a benefit to this particular person who left this comment. Also to those of you who are obviously subscribed and obviously watching these videos. If you like this video and you want to see more of these videos, definitely support us on Patreon, because we do additional videos for our monthly supporters just to say thanks for you helping us and empowering us to do more videos like this today, where we can help even more people come to faith, defend their faith, and ultimately strengthen their faith as well. God bless.